To truly understand why May 10th, 1996 went so tragically wrong, we need to go back and take a closer look at Everest's South Col, the critical staging point for climbers making their final push to the summit. The South Col, located at 26,000 feet, is the last stop before the final, grueling ascent to the top of the world. It's a place where climbers rest and prepare for what could be their final push, facing a delicate balance of exhaustion, freezing temperatures, and the thinning air of the death zone. By 1996, Mount Everest had become a commercialized mountain. This meant more and more climbers with varying degrees of skill and experience were making their way to the top, but they were paying high fees for the chance. Some of them were highly skilled professionals, but many others were simply eager adventurers, people who had trained for years but were not world-class mountaineers. The advent of commercial guiding allowed the dream of summiting Everest to become a reality for anyone with enough money to fund the costly expedition. And that's where the problem began. That year, several teams, all highly respected, had planned to summit on the same day. These included Adventure Consultants, led by Rob Hall, and Mountain Madness, led by Scott Fisher. There were also other smaller groups with guides and clients, all fighting for space on the narrow and perilous route to the top. The sheer number of climbers trying to ascend on the same day led to crowding, and not just any crowd, a deadly, slow-moving traffic jam at some of the most crucial sections of the climb. The route bottlenecked at certain points, including the infamous Hillary Step, an obstacle that requires climbers to scale a vertical rock face that rises 40 feet near the summit. There were also sections called the balcony, where climbers would have to wait in line, sometimes for extended periods of time, to make their way up. The problem was that the guides had not prepared for this bottleneck. The fixed ropes essential to climbing safely above the balcony and through the Hillary Step had not been installed in advance. Climbers, eager to reach the top, had to wait, sometimes for over an hour, while guides scrambled to install them in real time. Now, at 26,000 feet, waiting is deadly. As climbers waited for their chance to continue, their oxygen supplies dwindled. They were standing exposed in the thin air, their bodies growing weaker by the minute. At this altitude, the body starts to lose its strength rapidly. Muscles ache, numbness sets in. Even the simplest of tasks becomes difficult. The clock was ticking. Every minute spent waiting meant more oxygen lost, more heat lost, and more energy drained. It was at this moment that the fatal chain of events began to unfold. As the sun rose higher and the climbers continued their slow journey upward, the delays mounted. Soon, it became clear to the guides and the climbers themselves, they were hours behind schedule. Yet, despite the mounting problems, they pressed on. Why? Because the summit was so close. They could almost taste it. Some of the climbers had trained their whole lives for this moment. Some had traveled across the world, spending months in preparation. Some had already faced personal obstacles to get here, and this close to their goal, turning back felt like failure. But in the mountains, where conditions change rapidly and the stakes are incredibly high, pressing on when you should turn around can be the deadliest choice of all. And that's exactly what happened. At some point, the climbers should have made a critical decision to turn back, but they didn't. Instead, they pushed forward, risking everything for a chance at the summit. And as they did, the risks grew, and so did the tension. There was no room for error. The crowds were no longer just a logistical problem, they were a life or death issue. By the time the climbers reached the South Summit, a high plateau just before the final push to the top, the conditions had already begun to change. The weather, which had been somewhat clear earlier in the day, began to deteriorate rapidly. But despite this, the climbers continued pushing forward toward the summit. And that's when they made their fatal mistake. They reached the summit too late. Every mountaineer knows it, and every experienced guide will tell you the same thing. If you're not at the summit by 2 p.m., turn around. This rule is unbreakable, and it's built on cold, hard experience. The higher you climb, the less time you have to make it back to safety. Descending is always slower and more dangerous than ascending, especially above 26,000 feet, where the air is so thin that every movement becomes a laborious effort. But that's not all. Climbing Mount Everest requires navigating deadly crevices, ridge lines with steep drop-offs, and unpredictable weather. As the day wears on, conditions can change quickly. At that altitude, daylight is a precious resource. Once the sun dips behind the horizon, temperatures plunge and winds pick up, making it almost impossible to survive. But on May 10, 1996, climbers ignored this vital rule. Why? The truth is, summiting Everest is a dream come true for most climbers. After years of preparation, training, and a hefty financial investment, many felt like they could finally achieve the ultimate mountaineering feat. The summit was so close, it was right there, within their reach. The temptation to push just a little further was irresistible. And for those leading these expeditions, experienced guides like Rob Hall and Scott Fisher, the pressure to deliver on the summit promise weighed heavily. Clients had paid tens of thousands of dollars for this opportunity. They had trained hard, they had followed the rules, and now, at the summit, they were standing on the edge of history. But the mountain doesn't care about your dreams. The mountain only cares about its own rules. Despite the unspoken rule about turnaround time, many climbers reached the summit well after 2 p.m. Some reached it at 3 p.m., others at 3:30, and in the case of a few, it was even later. Among them were two of the most respected figures in the mountaineering world: Rob Hall, the founder of Adventure Consultants, and Scott Fisher, the leader of Mountain Madness. Hall and Fisher were two of the most experienced guides on Everest at the time. Hall had been guiding clients to the summit for over a decade, and Fisher was known for his exceptional climbing skills and leadership. Both of them knew the risks. But as the climbers climbed higher, there was an unspoken pressure not to disappoint the clients who had come so far. The summit was within their grasp, and both Hall and Fisher chose to let their clients continue upward, despite the growing risks. As the climbers made their final push to the top, the weather began to change, but no one could have predicted how quickly things would deteriorate. A seemingly stable weather window had been predicted earlier that day, but the jet stream was shifting and a storm cell was moving fast. At the summit, climbers were exposed to the brutal forces of nature: high winds, freezing temperatures, and a lack of oxygen. Many climbers were already exhausted. They had pushed themselves far beyond their limits, and now they were trapped in the death zone, the area above 26,000 feet where the human body cannot survive for long without supplemental oxygen. But it wasn't just the late summit that sealed their fate. The crowding on the mountain compounded the problems. As more climbers reached the summit and began their descent, the descent became a bottleneck. Those who had summited late now found themselves stuck in the dark, waiting for hours in freezing conditions to make it down. Despite the critical importance of turnaround times, the summit was still overcrowded with climbers, some struggling to descend. With no way to move forward or backward, the climbers were helpless. Every minute lost meant more oxygen drained, more body heat lost, and fewer chances of survival. In total, 8 climbers would perish that day, not because they didn't try hard enough, but because they didn't turn around when they should have. The delays, the crowding, the pushing of limits beyond reason, these were the forces that set the stage for disaster. As the day wore on and night began to fall, those who were still above 26,000 feet were now in serious danger. But for many, it was already too late. As the sun dipped below the horizon, and afternoon turned to evening on May 10th, the mood on Everest began to shift. The mountain, which had been calm for most of the day, now seemed to awaken with an angry energy. The temperature plummeted, winds began to rise, and then it happened. The storm hit. The first sign was a shift in the wind, a cold gust, followed by another, and soon the entire mountain was engulfed by a howling gale. What had been a manageable climb for many climbers quickly turned into an unthinkable fight for survival. The whiteout was sudden and severe. It wasn't just snowflakes flying in the air. No, it was a swirling, blinding fog of snow and ice that reduced visibility to zero. It's hard to understand just how disorienting this could be unless you've stood in a storm like this at extreme altitude. Imagine being completely blind, unable to see a few inches in front of your face. You can't even tell if you're standing up or lying down. You lose all sense of direction. Climbers later described it as like being trapped inside a ping pong ball. No up, no down, just a relentless whirling mass of white. The wind was so loud that it drowned out everything else. There were no voices, no sounds of footsteps, just the roar of the storm. At this point, the trail that had guided climbers up the mountain disappeared. The higher slopes of Everest offer no easy landmarks. There are no trees, no rocks that stand out, no natural markers to help you orient yourself. Once you lose the trail, you lose everything. Climbers who had ascended the south summit and were now making their way down, just a few hundred feet from the top, had no idea where they were. The fixed ropes that they had relied on were now impossible to follow. Guides and clients, separated in the whiteout, couldn't find each other. And those who did try to navigate through the storm found themselves moving in the wrong direction, getting lost or walking in circles. The wind was tearing across the mountain, pushing climbers to their limits. At this altitude, with the temperature well below freezing, every exposed part of the body began to freeze almost instantly. Fingers, toes, faces. The frostbite was quick and merciless. But it wasn't just the frostbite that threatened their survival, it was the altitude. Above 26,000 feet, oxygen is so thin that the human body begins to shut down. Even the most experienced climbers start to lose coordination, strength, and the ability to think clearly. Many climbers were struggling to breathe, their oxygen supplies running low. Cognitive function started to deteriorate. Those who had waited at key sections of the climb, like the balcony, now found themselves trapped in the whiteout, unable to descend. They had no idea if the climbers ahead of them were still there, or if they had become lost. And in this confusion, climbers continued to climb, hoping to find their way down, even though every step took them further away from safety. The storm wasn't just a normal weather event. It was the kind of storm that bends nature to its will. It was unforgiving and relentless. It didn't give any climber a second chance. In the midst of the chaos, 3 climbers from Rob Hall's team, Doug Hansen, Yasuko Namba, and another member, were stuck high on the mountain. They had been separated from the main group, their descent slowed to a crawl, and now with no fixed ropes, no visibility, and no guide, they were stuck in the storm. But it wasn't just Hall's team that was in danger. The entire mountain had become a battlefield. On the other side of Everest, Scott Fisher's team was also battling the elements. Fisher himself was struggling on the descent, his condition deteriorating quickly. His Sherpa, Lobsang Jongbu, was desperately trying to help him, but with the storm worsening, there was little that could be done. At this moment, Everest had become a cold, unforgiving nightmare. The storm raged on. Climbing was impossible. Descending was just as dangerous. And yet, the climbers had no choice. They had to keep moving. They had to try to survive. It would be hours before the storm would ease, but by then, the damage had already been done. High on Everest, in the midst of the storm, Rob Hall, the expedition leader of Adventure Consultants, was facing the hardest decision of his life. Hall had spent years guiding clients up and down the world's highest peak. He was no stranger to the dangers of Everest, and his clients trusted him. But on this particular day, as the storm raged around him and the hours ticked by, Hall found himself caught in a dilemma that would ultimately seal his fate. Hall was not alone. With him was Doug Hansen, a climber who had been attempting to reach the summit of Everest for years. Doug's story was one of perseverance. He had come agonizingly close to summiting the previous year, only to turn back just a few hundred feet from the top. This year, Doug was determined to finish what he had started. But Doug was struggling. By the time they reached the south summit, the situation was already perilous. The storm was growing stronger. Doug was exhausted, oxygen deprived, and his body was shutting down. Hall could see that Doug had no energy left. He was physically and mentally drained, too weak to continue on his own. But Rob Hall couldn't leave him behind. Hall, despite his own exhaustion, made a choice. He stayed behind with Doug Hansen, even though the storm was worsening, and even though time was running out. He couldn't abandon Doug, not when the man had come so far and had dreamed of standing on the summit for so long. Hall made a radio call to base camp. He explained that Doug was struggling and he couldn't continue without him. The guides urged him to descend alone, to save himself, but Rob Hall refused. He stayed with Doug in the freezing winds, the two men huddling together, just trying to hold on as the storm enveloped them. Hall kept in contact with base camp for a while, giving updates on their condition. But soon, as the hours passed and the storm showed no sign of abating, the radio communications stopped. The last communication from Rob Hall was a heart-wrenching message to his wife, Jan Arnold, who was pregnant with their child. With his final breaths, Hall spoke into the radio, trying to reassure her, trying to stay strong for the woman he loved. His words, his final moments were not of fear, but of love and sacrifice. Hall passed away in the storm, clinging to his client in the freezing night. Doug Hansen, too, died on the mountain. He never made it down, never lived to see the life he had fought so hard to achieve. He, too, was lost in the death zone, caught in the merciless grip of Everest's deadly cold. While Rob Hall was struggling to save Doug Hansen, Scott Fisher, another revered figure in the mountaineering world, was facing his own battle on the mountain. Fisher was known for his strength, his charisma, and his deep love for the mountains. He had been climbing Everest for years, and his team, Mountain Madness, was confident in his leadership. He had led expeditions on Everest and other peaks around the world, and his experience was undeniable. But on May 10th, Scott Fisher wasn't feeling like himself. The storm, the altitude, and the stress of the climb had taken its toll. Fisher was not the vibrant, strong leader he had been on earlier climbs. He was noticeably slower than usual, struggling with fatigue, and some of his teammates suspected he was not well. He was showing signs of exhaustion, perhaps even altitude sickness. But despite his condition, Fisher pushed onward, determined to reach the summit with his team. On the descent, Fisher's situation worsened. He collapsed near the balcony, a critical point just below the summit. His Sherpa, Lobsang Jangbu, did everything he could to help Fisher, but the conditions were beyond their control. The storm had turned Everest into a war zone, and the harsh winds and freezing temperatures made movement almost impossible. At this point, Fisher was unable to stand. His body had simply given up. Lobsang tried to keep him awake, tried to get him moving, but as the hours passed, it became clear that Scott Fisher would not make it off the mountain. Fisher, too, died on Everest that night. He was not far from the route he had guided so many times before, but the storm had stolen his life away in the same unforgiving way it had taken so many others. Two of the world's greatest mountaineers, two men who had devoted their lives to guiding others safely on the world's most dangerous peaks, had lost their lives on that tragic day. But amidst the overwhelming loss, there was a flicker of hope, a miracle that would defy the odds and forever change the way we think about survival on Everest. Beck Weathers was a climber who had joined the Adventure Consultants team alongside Rob Hall and Doug Hansen. But Weathers was no ordinary climber. He was blind in one eye and had limited vision in the other, a condition that would make climbing Everest almost impossible for most people. But Beck was determined to reach the top of the world. He had been training for this moment for years, and despite his physical condition, he pushed himself to the limits. But on May 10th, as the storm hit, Weathers' situation became dire. He was severely frostbitten and blinded by the storm, unable to see and disoriented by the violent winds. Weathers had been left behind by the group, abandoned on the mountain when he could no longer continue. Rescue teams had found him, but by the time they reached him, they thought it was too late. He had stopped breathing. His body was frozen solid, and they assumed there was no hope. They left him on the mountain, unable to carry him any further. But Beck Weathers didn't die. In the early morning hours as the storm subsided, Weathers somehow regained consciousness. His body, despite being near frozen and suffering from severe frostbite, forced itself to survive. With no guide, no rope, and no support, Weathers managed to stagger his way back to Camp 4. Alone, disoriented, and almost completely frozen, he had somehow summoned the strength to make the nearly impossible journey. When he reached the camp, the climbers there could hardly believe their eyes. They saw a man a ghostly figure stumbling out of the storm, barely alive. Weathers survived, though his body would never fully recover. He lost his nose, his fingers, and parts of his hands to frostbite. But he had made it back. He had beaten the odds and defied nature itself. His story remains one of the most extraordinary survival miracles in mountaineering history, a testament to the sheer will to live. When the storm finally passed on May 11th, 8 climbers had died. The mountain had claimed its victims, and the surviving climbers were left to pick up the pieces of a shattered expedition. But the legacy of May 10th, 1996, would forever alter the way the world saw Everest. The disaster sparked a massive international debate, with climbers, guides, and the world asking what went wrong. In the next section, we will explore the aftermath, the changes that came to Everest, and how the lessons of 1996 are still felt on the mountain today.